How did the death of one princess lead to the birth of another? And how did the royal family go from tragedy to triumph in just 18 months? It's a quasi-comical story of a royal baby race entered into by the ageing, unattractive, and generally quite unpopular bachelor sons of George III, as they dumped their mistresses and sought out respectable brides who could produce a legitimate heir to the throne. It's also the story of the conception, birth, and early years of the little girl one of them would father, who went on to give her name to an era, after traversing a bizarre path to the crown that involved having to outlive a shocking number of relations. This is how Victoria became queen. Our story starts with a tragedy which took place on the 6th of November 1817 in Claremont House in Surrey. There, Princess Charlotte of Wales, only legitimate child of the Prince Regent and future George IV, and his estranged wife Caroline of Brunswick, died after giving birth to a stillborn son. She was just 21 years old. The nation was heartbroken, not only because Charlotte was so well loved, but because she had been the only living legitimate grandchild of George III, who was by this time in the throes of a complete mental breakdown and living in seclusion. Charlotte's parents hated each other with a vengeance and had split up soon after her birth, and so there was little to no chance that her father would ever produce another living child born within wedlock. I know people joke about the idea of an heir and a spare sometimes, but this situation just goes to show why it's so important to have such a spare. The princess's death and that of her son immediately raised the spectre of a crisis. If none of George III's many children produced a legitimate heir, though between them they had spawned literally scores of illegitimate ones, what was going to happen? Well, let me tell you. The crown would have passed from one aged prince or princess to the next until all George III's kids were dead. We'd still have had George IV, who died in 1830, then his brother William IV, who expired in 1837. It would then have passed to their brother Prince Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, who died in 1851, at which point it would have gone to their sole surviving sibling, Princess Mary, who died in 1857. What then? Well, with no legitimate children from any of George's offspring, the crown would have reverted to the grandson of his sister, Princess Augusta, because none of his brothers had living descendants by that point. That means it would have gone in 1857 to Charles, Duke of Brunswick. He had no children, so it would have passed to his brother, William, in 1873. He also had no legitimate offspring, so upon his death it would have gone to the descendants of another of Princess Augusta's children, King Charles I of Württemberg, then to his nephew William II of Württemberg in 1891, who I couldn't even fit onto this convoluted yet at the same time heavily simplified family tree because it was just too much and I was starting to lose the will to carry on. Let's not take this hypothetical scenario any further, as it might make my head explode. Hopefully you see my point. The situation at the end of 1817 looked pretty dire. A series of elderly, short-reigning sovereigns, most of them foreigners, does not make for a healthy, stable, popular monarchy. Something had to be done, and that point was hammered home by one of the English newspapers, the Morning Chronicle, which ran an article shortly after Charlotte's death in which it called for her bachelor uncles to marry and secure the succession by producing legitimate children. At that point, the royal family looked like this. George III was still alive, but as I've said, he was completely incoherent due to causes which are still debated by doctors and historians to this day. His wife, Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was also still around, though she would die in November 1818. They had had 15 children in total, but for various reasons none had any legitimate offspring by November 1817. The youngest 3 were all dead, having never had the chance to marry and have children. Let's grey them out. The princesses had no legitimate surviving children between them, and with the youngest being 40 years old, They were considered too old for childbearing, though several of them were unmarried anyway. They're out of the conversation too. That left 7 sons. Let's take a look at them. The eldest, Prince George, was acting as the Prince Regent. As I've mentioned, he'd married his cousin Caroline of Brunswick, but their union was a disaster which produced just one child, and that child, Princess Charlotte, was now dead, as was her infant. There was no hope of any future children from that couple, and though George debated trying to get a divorce, he ultimately decided against it due to the incredibly poor publicity it would have generated. Let's discount him as well. Next was Prince Frederick, Duke of York. He was estranged from his wife and they had no children. No hope of an heir there either. He's out. Then came Prince William, Duke of Clarence, and Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, both unmarried. They were in with a chance of fathering a child. Their younger brother, Prince Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, was already married, but as of 1817 had no surviving children by his wife, Princess Frederica of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, but there was still a possibility they would produce, and in fact, spoiler alert, they did end up having a surviving son. Brother number 6 was Prince Augustus, Duke of Sussex. He'd contracted an initially secret marriage to a woman called Lady Augusta Murray back in 1793, but as he didn't have his father's permission to do so, the marriage was in contravention of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, it was considered legally void, and the prince's children were illegitimate. He could therefore have legally married someone else and produced fresh, legitimate offspring. Brother 7 was Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, also unmarried and also available for a bit of royal baby making. So at the close of 1817, there were 4 bachelor princes who could theoretically father a new heir, and it was to these men that the Morning Chronicle article addressed its plea. It did not fall on deaf ears. Before I tell you how these princes responded though, if you're enjoying this content and want more from me, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel with the notification bell switched on so you never miss one of my uploads. You can also become a channel member and get extra perks by clicking the join button under videos or on my channel homepage and then following the instructions given to you on screen. If you go to my website, historycallingofficial.com, you can also join my mailing list and get a free download with 5 quick and easy tips for spotting good history versus bad before you buy or start reading a book. Other places you can find me on the web are my Patreon site, where I share extra bonus material every week, my Amazon storefront, where I've put together lists of history-themed books, movies, TV shows and gifts for you to peruse, and my Instagram page. All of these platforms are linked below for you. Thank you too to those of you who donate to the channel using the thanks button under videos, as this is very kind and much appreciated. The newspaper article begging for some new royal babies soon found its way into the household of Prince Edward, who was then living in Brussels with his long-term mistress, Thérèse Bernardine Mongenet, known as Madame Saint-Laurent. He described what happened when the newspaper arrived to an English politician named Thomas Creevey, who wrote down the contents of their 13th of December conversation. According to him, Prince Edward said, "Upon receiving the paper containing that article at the same time with my private letters, I did as is my constant practice. I threw the newspaper across the table to Madame Saint-Laurent and began to open and read my letters. I had not done so but a very short time when my attention was called to an extraordinary noise and a strong convulsive movement in Madame Saint-Laurent's throat. For a short time I entertained serious apprehensions for her safety, and when, upon her recovery, I inquired into the occasion of this attack, she pointed to the article in the Morning Chronicle relating to my marriage." Edward carried on by explaining that he had been trying to keep the topic out of his mistress's mind ever since then, but all the while he was considering doing the very thing she feared the most, leaving her and seeking out a reputable wife who would provide him with a legitimate heir. As he told Creevey, "My brother, the Duke of Clarence, that's the future William IV, is the elder brother, and has certainly the right to marry if he chooses, and I would not interfere with him on any account. If he wishes to be king, to be married and have children, Poor man, God help him, let him do so. For myself, I am a man of no ambition, and wish only to remain as I am. Easter, you know, falls very early this year, the 22nd of March. If the Duke of Clarence does not take any step before that time, I must find some pretext to reconcile Madame Saint Laurent to my going to England for a short time. St. George's Day is the day now fixed for keeping the birthday, and my paying my respects to the Regent on that day will be a sufficient excuse for my appearing in England. When once there, it will be easy for me to consult with my friends as to the proper steps to be taken. Should the Duke of Clarence do nothing before that time as to marrying, it will become my duty, no doubt, to take some measures upon the subject myself. For all Edward said he had no ambition and wished only to remain as he was, it clearly wasn't true. In fact, he already had some potential brides in mind. He said to Creevey, "You have heard the names of the Princess of Baden and the Princess of Saxe-Coburg mentioned. The latter connection would perhaps be the better of the two, from the circumstance of Prince Leopold being so popular with the nation. Prince Leopold was the widower of Princess Charlotte, and the Princess of Saxe-Coburg was his sister. But before anything is proceeded with in this matter, I shall hope and expect to see justice done by the nation and the ministers to Madame Saint Laurent." Edward obviously had affection for his mistress, with whom he'd been living for 27 years, no doubt thinking that as the fourth son, the job of providing an heir was never going to fall to him. But when the possibility of fathering said heir suddenly raised its head, he dropped her like a stone. It helped too that this permanently in debt prince expected a handsome financial reward from Parliament if he married a suitable bride. Madame Saint Laurent was pensioned off, and Edward went wife hunting. He wasn't the only one of his brothers to do so. As he noted himself, Prince William, Duke of Clarence, had a better shot as he was the older brother, and he too set about getting a spouse. Prince Augustus showed no interest in entering the race, but Prince Adolphus evidently decided to give it a go, despite how far down the line of succession he was. He made it to the altar first, in fact, marrying Princess Augusta of Hesse-Cassel on the 7th of May 1818 in Hesse. They had a second ceremony in England on the 1st of June. His big brothers weren't far behind him, though. Edward did indeed marry Prince Leopold's sister, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, in Coburg on the 29th of May, then also came back to England and went through another ceremony on the 11th of July, during which Prince William was also married to Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. By the way, apologies if I'm pronouncing all these German place names incorrectly. I'm not German. In 1819, the fruits of these emergency royal marriages began to arrive. On the 26th of March, Prince Adolphus became the father of a healthy baby boy, who was displaced in the line of succession the following day by the birth of a daughter to William and Adelaide. This girl, who was another Charlotte, had been born prematurely though, and died shortly after birth. Barely 2 months later, and after a frantic dash back to England to make sure the baby was born on British soil and could not be denied the crown on account of having arrived in a foreign land, on the morning of the 24th of May, Prince Edward and his wife also had a daughter. She was named Princess Alexandrina Victoria, and she outranked Adolphus's boy. 3 days later, Prince Ernest and the Duchess of Cumberland also had a boy named George. It is unlikely that any of these children, and a few more I have yet to mention, would have existed if not for the death of their cousin Princess Charlotte and her child, and as such they all made their entrance into the world under quite strange circumstances. It was a triumph, though. Having had no legitimate grandchildren in November 1817, the ailing George III now had 3, not that he knew anything about it. A succession crisis had been averted. This frantic royal baby race was the subject of keen speculation and jokes amongst the newspapers and satirists of the time, one of which you see here in a print which came out in the early spring of 1819. Prince Adolphus and his wife, the Duchess of Cambridge, are showing off their healthy son, while Prince William and Adelaide, Duchess of Clarence, who had just lost their daughter, remember, stand to the left of the image, with Adelaide saying that her short-lived child had been much prettier than the new baby, though the print incorrectly says that she'd had a boy, and William insisting that they would try again. Prince Edward and the Duchess of Kent, who is heavily pregnant with the future Queen Victoria, are to the right, while further to the right are Prince Ernest and the Duchess of Cumberland, complaining that they now have no chance of getting one of their children on the throne, despite the Duchess also being heavily pregnant at the time with a child who would displace Adolphus's in the succession. The Duchess of York, estranged wife of Prince Frederick, stands in front of them. We know, of course, that little Alexandrina, who was called Drina in her youth, but who would eventually go by the name Victoria, would go on to become queen, despite being born only fifth in line for the throne. But in 1819, the royal baby race was still very much in progress, and the princess could have, and nearly did, lose her chance at the crown in one of many ways. The most immediate threat was if Adelaide had a child, and in fact, after the death of her daughter Charlotte, the Duchess became pregnant again very quickly. However, she miscarried in September 1819. The second possibility was that the Kents would go on to produce a boy, for a brother would have outranked his older sister Victoria. This possibility was ended, though, by the death of her father, Prince Edward, on the 23rd of January 1820, when his daughter was just 8 months old. 6 days later, his father, George III, died too. The Prince Regent now became George IV, and in the space of a week, Victoria had moved up to be third in line after her uncles, Prince Frederick and Prince William. If any of these three men had a surviving legitimate child, though, it was curtains for her chances of becoming queen. She was, after all, the daughter of a fourth son, and it's very unusual for someone so far down the line to actually make it to the throne. There were a few more wobbles, if we can call them that, over the course of the 1820s. On the 6th of August 1820, Prince Frederick's estranged wife died. He was now free to wed again and produce a child, a possible threat which would remain in place for years to come. Then, on the 10th of December that year, came what would turn out to be the most serious challenge to Victoria ever becoming queen. Prince William and his wife Adelaide had a daughter called Princess Elizabeth, and she became the new third in line to the throne, pushing her cousin down to fourth. Had she survived, she would have been Queen Elizabeth II, but instead she lived only for 3 months, dying on the 4th of March 1821. Victoria rose back up to third position. The next potential danger came with the death on the 7th of August 1821 of Caroline of Brunswick, George IV's wife and queen, though he hated her so much he wouldn't even let her attend his coronation. It was now theoretically possible that he might remarry and have another child, putting an end to all Victoria's prospects. But again, just as with Prince Frederick, this didn't happen. No one knew that at the time, however, and it still must have seemed a risky bet to assume that this little princess would ever be queen. In 1822, Duchess Adelaide was pregnant again with twin boys, but she lost them both on the 8th of April, and so Victoria retained her position in the line of succession. 5 years later, in January 1827, Prince Frederick died, putting an end to the threat of a remarriage and a baby cousin from him who could have displaced her. She was now second in line after her uncle William. In June 1830, George IV died, William became king, and Victoria was at last the heiress presumptive. Queen Adelaide was nearly 38 years old and had not been pregnant since 1822. The chances seemed increasingly remote that she would become mother to a future king or queen. It now seemed all but certain that Victoria's destiny was to become monarch. That destiny, which had been put in motion nearly 20 years earlier by the death of her cousin, Princess Charlotte, finally caught up to her on the 20th of June 1837. That was the day that William IV died, and the girl who had been born fifth in line, who had had to outlive her father, grandfather, 3 uncles, and various infant cousins, finally became sovereign at the age of 18. By that stage, the crown was much more secure than it had been in the wake of Charlotte's passing. Even if Victoria had died young, it would not have had to go on the long journey through a selection of ancient princes and princesses that looked worryingly possible in late 1817. Remember that her uncle, Prince Ernest, Duke of Cumberland, who became King of Hanover upon the death of William IV, as Victoria could not inherit that title as a woman, did have one surviving child with his wife, and until Victoria had her own children, this uncle and cousin were her immediate heirs. Her uncle Adolphus also produced 3 legitimate children in the end, the boy born in 1819 and 2 girls born in 1822 and 1833. Through his youngest, he was the grandfather of Mary of Teck, who married George V, and so just like Victoria's own father, his descendants ended up inheriting the throne just a few generations later. Still, it is remarkable that having had 15 children, George III and Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz only ever had 6 legitimate grandchildren who survived infancy, and that includes the doomed Princess Charlotte of Wales, with 5 of them born in 1819 or later. I hope you found that explanation of the unusual reason Queen Victoria was born and her bumpy path to the throne interesting. Let me know in the comments if you found yourself in the position these royal bachelors did in 1817. Would you have bothered marrying as fast as possible and trying to produce an heir, or would you have thought it just wasn't worth the hassle? For more on the life of Victoria and her wacky Hanoverian family, try one of these videos next. And until next time, keep learning.